Hello Year 9 and welcome to Lesson 7 of this Year 9 unit on the British sector on the Western Front. I'm Mr. James, your teacher for today, and our lesson title is this: How did the evacuation of injured soldiers change over time? Now, same as ever, please get these three things. You need your history workbook in front of you, you're going to need a pen, and ideally you're going to need some scrap paper. And remember, switch off all those distractions so that you can concentrate. It means that you will learn things far quicker. Press pause if you need to get yourself ready before we move on. Our first activity is our Do Now Knowledge Recall quiz. In Lesson 6 with Mr. Sandbrook, you would have looked at developments in surgery and medicine during World War I. You've got 5 questions here, as you can see. Give them a go, and then we'll compare your answers to the correct ones and give yourself a mark out of 5. Press pause now so that you can do the questions. Okay, here are the answers to our Do Now quiz. Here's number 1. What 1916 invention pulled an injured man's leg straight, thus reducing blood loss? And you should have got for that the Thomas splint. Number 2, what did the Carroll-Dakin method do? You should have written something like, well, it passes chemicals through a wound. Number 3, based on number 2, is this: what problem was the Carroll-Dakin method trying to solve? And there we say it's trying to solve infections in wounds. Number 4, what was the specialism of Harold Gillies' Queen's Hospital? The answer to that is facial wounds. And then lastly, you should have put the discovery of sodium citrate and glucose allowed blood to be stored. Press pause, mark your answers, correct any mistakes you made, give yourself a mark out of 5. In today's lesson, Year 9, as we've said already, our title is How did the evacuation of injured soldiers change over time? There are 3 objectives. Number 1, you need to know the main stages of the chain of evacuation. Number 2, you need to know the role of the RAMC, and you need to know the role of the FANY. And yes, that does stand for Fanny. My mum is very disappointed at this moment I just said that. Number 3, you need to identify the ways the treatment and evacuation of soldiers who are injured changes over time. If you're still sniggering at Fanny, grow up and we'll move on to the next slide. Excellent. Now grab your knowledge organiser. There's quite a bit that we have to highlight on this one. Firstly, grab your highlighter, go up to themes at the top, and we need to highlight number 4, the work of the RAMC and Fanny. Once you've done that, then go to the right to terrain and transport, and we need to highlight number 2, ambulance wagons, 3, ambulance trains, and 4, ambulance barges. Do that now. Lastly, right in the middle of your page, you can see evacuation route. You need to highlight all 4 of those. Excellent. Once you've done that, you can pop it away, and then we'll move on with our lesson. Your first job, Year 9, is to study Source A. This is not Source A, I just thought I'd include it. As you study Source A, though, on your work booklet, I'd like you to think about three things. Number one, why do you think the first thing that happened to new arrivals was that they were given a cup of cocoa and had their particulars taken? And as a hint, when Source A refers to particulars, it means personal details. Then, number two, think about the usefulness of this source in helping establish the key stages in the chain of evacuation. And then thirdly, what other sources would give you useful information about this? Try and think of as many as possible. Press pause, write your ideas down. Okay, let's see how we did, and you can compare your answers to mine. For number one, I thought the following. Well, firstly, giving someone a cup of cocoa was just part of good medical care. You're comforting someone who's obviously weary because, remember, he's walked to this base hospital. Number two, linked to that, because he's been tired and because comfort is part of good medical care, he needs to be looked after. Number three refers to the particulars, those personal details. I think it means that keeping good records was obviously essential due to the chaotic nature of the war. It would be easy to not know where people are, for people to be missing, and so you needed to check constantly who it was you had in front of you. For number two, I thought this source was useful and not useful in slightly different ways. Firstly, it tells us how some men arrived to the hospital. This man has walked. It's also a first-hand account. This is from a medical orderly, someone who works in a hospital, and so therefore we can establish that he would have witnessed this, and therefore it would be reliable. It tells us accurate, useful information. It also tells us the process upon arrival to the hospital. The cocoa and the particulars are taken. However, it's not useful because, well, we don't know if this is typical. Did every hospital offer cocoa and ask for particulars, personal details to be taken? We also don't know where this hospital is. And we don't know about the other parts of the chain of the evacuation. Did you just immediately go to hospital when you were injured? Lastly, it also doesn't tell us about treatments. In terms of other sources that might give us useful information, I thought of this. You could look at other first-hand reports, army records, newspaper accounts, and even medical records, particularly if you want to find out about different types of treatment. Press pause and add any ideas you didn't get to yours. Now, here's some new knowledge. The chain of evacuation. The responsibility of caring for the wounded fell on the Royal Army Medical Corps, the RAMC. Now, the large number of casualties resulted in a huge increase in the number of medical professionals needed on the Western Front. You know this because, for example, on the first day of the Somme, 57,000 casualties were caused. Huge numbers. Therefore, as this table shows, the number of medical officers and other officers in the RAMC increases rapidly throughout the war. In fact, by 1918, over half of Britain's doctors are posted on the Western Front. At the same time as a huge impact and burden being placed on the Royal Army Medical Corps, we also need, as the British Army, to come up with a system to get injured soldiers from no man's land and the frontline trench to medical facilities. This is what's known as the chain of evacuation, the process of getting injured soldiers from the front to medical facilities. There were 5 stages to this chain of evacuation created by the British Army. Stage 1 was the stretcher bearers. We'll talk about those in a bit, but you don't need to know loads about them. More importantly, you need to know about the regimental aid post, known as the RAP. You then need to know about field ambulance and dressing stations, abbreviated to ADS, Advanced Dressing Station, and MDS as well. You need to know about the Casualty Clearing Station, or CCS. And then lastly, just like our source, you need to know about base hospitals, where our source told us about the cup of cocoa and the particulars. Let's go through each of these in turn. But before that, let's just make some key points. Firstly, these are just the main parts of the chain of evacuation that we are mentioning. Secondly, please don't assume that every single injured soldier, every single casualty would go through each stage. They might skip stages. So we can say this: some casualties may have skipped stages. And lastly, please remember that the aim was to get soldiers back to the front so they could continue fighting. Here's our first stage: stretcher bearers. Stretcher bearers would be the ones who are going to collect the wounded from no man's land or a trench, as you can see here, and carry the wounded back on stretchers if they couldn't walk for themselves. There are only 16 of these in every battalion, which is 1,000 men. And as you can see, it requires 4 soldiers or stretcher bearers to carry one injured soldier. In particularly muddy terrain, it might include more people carrying the stretcher. And so 16 per every 1,000, i.e. 4 stretchers of 4 stretcher bearers, making 16, wasn't particularly many. Many men would have to make their own way back if they could. Stretcher bearers would bring the injured to the regimental aid post first. This regimental aid post, as you can see, was often located very near the front line trench. In fact, it was about 200 meters from the front line, in a communication trench or in a deserted building, as you can see here. Again, wounded men would either be carried here on stretcher or walk here themselves, and the job of the RAP was to give immediate first aid to the injured soldiers. And if possible, you get as many back in fighting condition as quickly as possible. It couldn't deal with serious injuries, and so if you were seriously injured, you'd have to go to the next stage of the chain of evacuation. That next stage was known as the dressing station. An ADS, an advanced dressing station, was supposed to be about 400 meters from a RAP. A main dressing station, or MDS, should be about a mile or so away, but often this wasn't the case. Like the RAP though, if possible, these would be located in abandoned buildings, or sometimes in dugouts and bunkers, for added protection from enemy shelling from their artillery. Stations would have 10 medical officers, plus medical orderlies, and stretcher bearers of the RAMC. But again, most people wouldn't be stretchered, they'd walk there. The people that worked at a dressing station were known as the field ambulance. This is confusing. So the field ambulance was a group of people, it's not a vehicle. The field ambulance was the group of people from the RAMC who worked at a dressing station. And each field ambulance and their dressing station could treat roughly around 100 to 150 wounded men. But it could not treat them for more than a week. Either you returned to the front to go fighting, or you moved on to the next stage. The next stage was the casualty clearing station. CCSs, or casualty clearing stations, were located away from the front line, so they were out of the range of the enemy's attacks, but they were accessible by ambulance wagon. Buildings like factories and schools were often used. Ideally, they'd be near railway lines or canals so that ambulance trains or ambulance barges could transport the injured further. At the CCS, casualties were divided into 3 groups. This was known as triage, from the French word which means to sort. The first group would be the walking wounded. These men could return to fight after being patched up. The second group were those who needed to go to hospital, and the third group were those who had no chance of recovery. And it was at this point where the casualty clearing station staff would make sure that those men were comfortable before they died. The last stage in our process was our base hospital. Again, at the CCS in the stage before, it would have been decided who needed to go to hospital, who was going to not recover, and who could be sent back to the front. These hospitals were located near the French and Belgian coast, which meant that men could be transported back to Britain if they needed to be. There were 2 types, a stationary hospital and a general hospital, but in practice they worked in similar ways. Men were treated in both until they could be returned to fight, or they had to be sent back to Britain for further treatment. As the war progressed, base hospitals became more experimental and bigger. They experimented with putting soldiers with particular types of wounds together on the same wards, which meant that hospitals and their doctors could become experts in a particular area. For example, you might put everyone with a chest wound in the same area of the hospital, so that doctor becomes an expert in those particular cases. Therefore, there are 5 stages to our chain of evacuation. At this point, you're ready to do your main activities. Find activity 7.3 in your booklet, press pause on the PowerPoint, and you've got 4 tasks, A through to D, and as you can see, I've done the first row of table B for you. Our last activity is about further research. Again, it's another poem, this time from a Canadian medical officer called John McCrae. If you click the link to the Royal British Legion website, you can read about him, read about his poem in Flanders Fields, and read about his links to our remembrance services that we do even today. Year 9, you've done really well. Excellent job. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more lessons for Year 9 students and for other years. Have a lovely day.